Rain whispered against the stained glass windows of the small church, its rhythmic tapping the only sound as dawn broke over the sleepy Lagos suburb. Inside, the air was cool, scented faintly with old wood, candle wax, and something gentler, perhaps mercy. Pastor Brian Matthews, a man in his early 40s with tired eyes and a spirit both gentle and resilient, stepped through the doors like he did every morning. His footsteps echoed softly across the tiled floor as he made his way toward the altar. As always, Jeremiah was there, curled up on the back pew, wrapped in the same threadbare blanket that barely shielded him from the morning chill. He was a fixture now, silent and still, like one of the stained windows, unnoticed by many but faithfully present. A new church volunteer, barely out of university, lingered near the door and whispered, "Pastor, why do we let that man sleep here every night? He doesn't even talk to anyone." Pastor Brian glanced back, offering a faint smile before turning his gaze to the slumbering figure. "Because sometimes," he said gently, "the broken only speak in silence." Then he knelt to pray, letting the peace of the morning wrap around him. But today, something shifted. A soft, strangled sound drifted from the pew. Jeremiah stirred in his sleep, his lined face twitching, tears slipping down the corners of his eyes. Then came the name, barely audible but heavy as thunder. "Lillian, I'm sorry." The words stopped Pastor Brian mid-prayer. He opened his eyes, staring toward the man he'd seen but never really known. That one name cracked something open, an old pain, long buried. Who was Lillian, and what was Jeremiah hiding behind those silent eyes? Jeremiah moved through life like a ghost, wrapped in quiet dignity. Each morning after the congregation departed, he would silently sweep the aisles, straighten hymn books, and gather forgotten Bibles with the care of a man tending sacred ground. He never asked for anything, not even thanks. Clad in the same faded brown coat each day, his frame hunched more from memory than age, he carried an air of quiet reverence. No one had ever seen him eat, beg, or speak beyond the softest murmurs in sleep. And tucked inside his coat, though no one yet knew, was a weathered photograph, his only remaining tether to a world long gone. Pastor Brian Matthews watched him from a distance with both compassion and worry. A young man with an old soul, Brian had taken over the modest church from his late father and was determined to lead it with the grace he had been taught. But grace alone wasn't enough to pay bills. Tithes had dwindled. The roof leaked in 2 places. Just last month, he'd made the painful decision to let go of the few paid staff, relying now on eager volunteers, some more helpful than others. Chief among them was Sister Amaka, a middle-aged woman with a spine as straight as her moral compass. She was efficient, but where Brian saw a man clinging to dignity, she saw a nuisance. "He sleeps on holy ground, Pastor," she often muttered, arms crossed, eyes sharp. What example does that set for the children? Yet the children loved Jeremiah. They called him Grandpa Meyer behind his back, giggling as he made small wooden toys from leftover scraps found around the church. He never joined their games but would smile faintly when they offered him biscuits or tried to braid his thinning hair. Occasionally, when he rolled up his sleeves on hot afternoons, the calloused strength of his hands told another story. Deep cuts, hardened skin, the kind that came from years of holding hammers, not hymnals. The past clung to him in silence, fueling the whispers in the community. Some claimed he had been a builder who lost everything in a fire. Others swore he had done something unforgivable, maybe even gone mad, but no one knew for sure. Pastor Brian tried more than once to draw him out, offering meals, warm clothes, quiet conversations. Jeremiah always accepted the gesture but not the invitation. He would nod, perhaps mutter a quiet, "Thank you," then drift away before questions followed. In a world that demanded explanations, Jeremiah's silence was both shield and punishment. Yet Brian persisted, not because he thought he could fix Jeremiah, but because he understood what it meant to carry burdens in silence. As the church struggled to stay afloat and judgment pressed in from all sides, Brian held to one truth. Not all broken things are meant to be discarded. Some, like Jeremiah, just need a place where they can still feel human. The rain had returned with a vengeance that night, hammering against the church roof as wind howled through the narrow lanes of the sleeping suburb. Pastor Brian had stayed behind after evening prayers, locking up late and checking for leaks when a flicker of movement near the altar caught his eye. At first, he thought it was the storm playing tricks, until he saw the slumped figure on the cold marble floor. "Jeremiah!" he shouted, rushing forward. The old man lay curled on his side, breath shallow, hands trembling slightly. His coat was soaked through, face pale, lips tinged with blue. Panic surged through Brian as he cradled him gently and called for help. Hours later, under the sterile glow of the hospital's emergency ward, Pastor Brian sat in silence as the doctor spoke in low tones. It's exhaustion, severe, possibly trauma-induced. His heart is stable, but he's not waking up yet. Whatever this man has been carrying, it's too heavy. The words echoed painfully, and as Brian nodded, the nurse handed over a small bag containing Jeremiah's few possessions: his coat, a rusted key, a wooden cross, and a folded photograph, creased, faded, fragile with age. Brian stared at it. In the image, a woman stood smiling, radiant and strong, with a little girl balanced on her hip, her eyes wide and bright with mischief. Scrawled on the back in hurried, uneven handwriting, "Lillian and Grace, forgive me." The names hit Brian like a spark to dry wood. Who were they? A family? A lost past? A mistake too great to name? He couldn't sleep that night. Back at the church, lightning casting shadows across the stained glass, he combed through old archives in the musty storage room beneath the vestry. Church records, old newsletters, baptism logs. He searched for Lillian, for Grace, for any trace of Jeremiah beyond the man who swept the floors, and slowly a thread began to emerge. A name: Jeremiah Cole, a brilliant contractor from the early 2000s, known for building half the new homes in the area during Lagos's construction boom. Talented, respected, married to a schoolteacher, one daughter, then silence. A footnote in an old newspaper clipping finally gave him the missing piece. Local contractor vanishes after fatal building collapse kills 3, including child. The words blurred as Brian read them again and again. Jeremiah hadn't just faded into poverty, he had vanished after tragedy, after a structure he built failed, claiming lives, including, Brian suspected, the little girl in the photo, Grace. The puzzle pieces fell together with a terrible weight. The silent man in the pews wasn't just broken. He was a man running from ghosts, perhaps even his own. And now, for the first time, Pastor Brian saw the storm inside him clearly. The narrow road wound past tired shops and old jacaranda trees before leading to a modest school compound tucked between low fences. Pastor Brian's hands were clenched around the steering wheel, heart thudding as he waited for the bell to ring. A teacher stepped out moments later, tall, graceful, composed. Lillian, her eyes, dark and distant, held the weariness of someone who had lived too long with unanswered questions. When Brian introduced himself and mentioned Jeremiah, she stiffened, her voice clipped. "I haven't heard that name in 15 years. Over tea in a quiet staff room, her mask began to crack. Yes, she was once married to Jeremiah Cole. Yes, Grace was their daughter. And yes, she had died in that collapse. Her voice didn't tremble, but the rage beneath it simmered, buried, but alive. It was his building. He promised it was safe. I remember the night. Sirens, dust in the air, people screaming. I begged him not to go into that darkness in his own mind, but he did. He shut down, and then he left." Her gaze found the window, hollow. "He chose shame over love. I lost a child. Then I lost my husband to guilt. He walked out and never came back." Brian returned to the hospital, heavy with the weight of her words. Jeremiah had awoken earlier that day, weak but lucid. When Brian stepped into the room, he was met with eyes that had seen too much. The old man tried to sit, wincing with the effort, but refused help. "She was in there," he whispered hoarsely, staring at nothing. "I saw the walls crack. I felt the ground shake. Grace was inside. I built it. I signed the drawings. They trusted me, and I—" His voice broke. A raw sob caught in his throat. "I failed them." Brian sat beside him quietly, letting the silence settle before asking, "Why didn't you come back? Why disappear?" Jeremiah looked at him, eyes hollow but unflinching. "Because pain eats you alive when you stay. And shame." He struggled for breath. "Shame doesn't want company. I thought leaving was mercy. For her, for me, for everyone." Brian wanted to tell him that maybe staying would have been harder and braver, but he couldn't speak past the knot in his throat. Meanwhile, the church pulsed with unease. Sister Amaka, already sharpening her disapproval into weaponry, cornered Brian after Sunday service. "This man, this ghost, you've taken under your wing. He's bringing shame on the church. People are talking. Families don't want their children near him." Her words weren't the only ones. Donors, already thin on patience and finances, began murmuring about withholding contributions unless Jeremiah was removed from church grounds. "We're a place of healing, not a shelter for criminals," one board member had said bluntly. The pressure mounted like heat beneath a sealed roof. Brian stood at a crossroads, torn between duty and conviction. Protecting Jeremiah meant risking the fragile future of the church, jobs, food drives, school sponsorships. But abandoning him felt like endorsing the same cruelty that had driven the man into silence for over a decade. In private moments, Brian prayed not just for guidance, but for strength, to hold both truth and grace in his hands without dropping either. What do you do when compassion threatens your calling? When righteousness comes at the cost of survival? And in the quiet of that tension, the storm kept brewing. Inside Jeremiah, inside Lillian, inside the heart of a pastor who now knew too much to walk away. The message appeared overnight, scrawled in thick red paint across the front doors of the church. "Murderer." The letters bled down the wood like a wound, bold and unforgiving. By morning, whispers had turned into open condemnation. Church members stood outside in uneasy clusters, avoiding eye contact. Some crossed themselves before entering, others turned away entirely. Inside, the air was heavier than prayer. Pastor Brian stared at the defaced doors, heart pounding. He had feared backlash, but not this. Not hate painted on holy ground. Sister Amaka wasted no time. She confronted him with her usual fire, but this time it crackled with deep betrayal. "You're risking everything we've built for a coward, for a man who buried the truth and let a child die. What are you protecting, his guilt or your pride?" Her words stung, not because they were cruel, but because they carried the bitter flavour of truth twisted by judgment. That afternoon, Jeremiah vanished. No one saw him leave the hospital. No note, no farewell. Brian knew immediately where he had gone. He drove with urgency, past markets and memories, to the place where it all began, the site of the collapse. It had changed over the years. The rubble was gone, replaced now by a small government primary school with brightly painted walls and a cheerful signboard. Children's laughter echoed faintly from the far end, but Jeremiah stood at the edge of the fence, a statue frozen in sorrow. His coat flapped in the breeze, the photo of Grace and Lillian still tucked into the pocket, worn soft from years of quiet pilgrimage. Brian approached but said nothing. The old man spoke first, his voice hollow and tired. "I come here every year," he whispered, eyes locked on the building. "On the anniversary, I stand right here and I talk to her, to Grace. I tell her I'm sorry, that I miss her laugh, that I still see her in my dreams." His voice cracked, the weight of years collapsing all at once. But sorry doesn't rebuild broken hearts. It doesn't give a mother back her child. It doesn't make the screams stop. He gripped the fence as though it was the only thing holding him upright. Just then, a car door slammed behind them. Brian turned. Lillian was walking toward them, eyes red, hands clenched. He had called her earlier, not knowing if she would come, but she had. When she saw Jeremiah, her composure shattered. "You left me to bury her alone," she screamed, voice raw with anguish. "Do you know what that was like? Picking out a coffin for a child alone? Explaining to people why my husband vanished like a ghost. You ran like a coward." Jeremiah didn't flinch. He stepped forward, tears spilling freely now. "Because every breath reminded me that she died because of me," he said, voice trembling. "Every sound of a child laughing broke me. I couldn't stay. I couldn't look at you and not fall apart." He paused, then added, "But you're right. I should have stayed. I should have held your hand and faced the pain with you. I should have grieved beside you instead of inside myself." The silence that followed was not peace, but something deeper. The dam between them burst. Lillian collapsed against him, not in forgiveness, but in the release of a decade's worth of sorrow. They cried, not to fix, not to reconcile, but to finally feel it all. Pastor Brian stepped back, tears in his own eyes, knowing this was holy ground, not made of brick or stained glass, but of truth laid bare. The sky was overcast. The morning Lillian stood beside Jeremiah at Grace's grave. For the first time in 15 years, he was there, not hiding, not grieving alone in the shadows, but present. His hands trembled slightly as he knelt and placed the small wooden cross he had carved himself. Her name etched delicately into the grain, Grace Cole. It was simple, beautiful, made with love and tears soaked into the wood. Lillian said nothing, But she didn't stop him. She let him cry. She even placed her hand on his shoulder, just for a moment. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a beginning. Word of the moment traveled quietly through the congregation. People began to see not just the man who had once disappeared, but the one who had always been among them, unseen. Pastor Brian stood before his church one Sunday, voice calm but firm. "Do you remember when our stained glass window was shattered last year during the storm?" he asked. Murmurs rippled through the pews. It was Jeremiah who stayed back and fixed it, by hand, quietly, without ever asking for thanks. The room fell still. For the first time, the weight of judgment began to lift. Even Sister Amaka sat rigid in her seat, eyes lowered, hands clenched in her lap. That evening, she approached Brian privately and offered her resignation from the volunteer board. "I mistook silence for guilt," she whispered, "but it was grief, and I was wrong." In the weeks that followed, the church began to shift. Pastor Brian offered Jeremiah a formal role, not out of charity, but out of respect. Not for pity, he told him gently, but for purpose. Jeremiah accepted, shoulders straighter than they had been in years. As caretaker, he did more than sweep floors. He taught. The young boys from the youth fellowship began gathering around him in the afternoons, learning to hold a hammer, plane wood, build something with their own hands. Together, they repaired pews, built shelves, restored the altar rail. The sound of wood being shaped replaced the silence of shame. Jeremiah said little, but his actions spoke louder than any sermon. The same hands that had once built a structure that fell were now building a place of restoration, not just of wood, but of spirit. Slowly he became part of the church's heartbeat. Lillian visited sometimes. They spoke briefly after services, about work, about the children, not about the past, not yet, but their words no longer carried ice. There was warmth now, a cautious truce. Healing didn't come with a grand gesture. It came quietly, through presence, through time. And in that quiet, Jeremiah found what he never thought he deserved: redemption, not through forgiveness alone, but through faithful service and the soft, steady return of grace. The church was quiet again, bathed in the soft golden glow of evening light streaming through the stained glass windows. The air hummed with the scent of old wood and candle wax, and Pastor Brian moved silently through the aisles, doing one last check before locking up. As he neared the back, his eyes fell on a familiar sight: Jeremiah, curled gently on the last pew, eyes closed, breathing steady. But this time, there was no tension in his shoulders, no weariness carved into his face. He wasn't hiding, he was resting, peacefully. Above the entrance, newly mounted and lovingly carved by Jeremiah's own hands, hung a small wooden plaque. The engraving read, "In honor of Grace Cole, the light we lost, the love we found again." Brian stood there for a long moment, heart full. He didn't disturb the man who had taught them all how to carry sorrow with grace. Instead, he smiled and whispered, as if to the empty pews, or perhaps to something greater. Sometimes, God sends healing not through miracle, but through broken men who still choose to build. The church fell into stillness once more, the kind that feels like prayer. And as the last light faded behind the stained glass, everything else did too, fade to black.